Good morning, good morning, good morning. We are live and in color somewhere. I notice that the attire is beginning to look a little more Christmassy. Of course, the best Christmas present I could get is seeing Betty Riggs walk in this morning. I hope you all had a wonderful week. We're a little chilly. Not as chilly as the week before, but, for me anyway, but a little chilly. And so it is good to be here with all of you this morning. A little distraction in the balcony. Yeah. So we are studying this quarter the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And if you were able to be with us last week, we spent a lot of time on history. I'm sorry to inform you that we're going to be spending a lot of time on history the entire quarter because these are historical books. We barely scratched the surface of the first chapter last week. So today I hope to finish and maybe even finish chapter 2, because chapter 2 is a lot of names and numbers. And you will find I'm not going to read them all. If you want to grab a Bible and open up to Ezra 2 at some point in time, you can read all of those names. I don't even think I can pronounce a lot of them, but they are there. And we'll get there soon enough. Last week when we were kind of closing the lesson, I mentioned that Cyrus was moved by God to do what he did. Good morning, Steve. It is good to see you moving this morning. I also reminded you that God can work through any entity, man or nation. When bad people do good things, it's very possible that they're acting in the interest of God. Don't forget, there's a flip side. Good people can do bad things, but there's another force at work. And so, we always got to pay attention to what's going on. Now, here's our timeline slide. I'll probably bring it up maybe every week, just to kind of remind you of what's going on here. We're still in the first return to Jerusalem, which is in chapters 1 and 2. And like I said, I'm hoping we get that finished this week. But it'll kind of help keep us moving and keep everything in frame. Somebody asked me what was the 58-year gap in the middle. The 58-year gap, that was where Esther fit. Just so you know. If you're keeping track and things like that, Esther kind of sandwiched in the middle there. And some of that will become obvious as we study through Ezra. Maybe not perfectly. So last week we got through the first 4 verses. Let's just pick it up and we'll figure out where we're going here. So it says, "Then rose up the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred up to go to rebuild the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem. And all who were about them aided them with vessels of silver and gold and goods, with beasts and with costly wares, besides all that was freely offered." Well, you ever remember had this happening before, with the people being predisposed to contribute to the loot? Yeah, when they were leaving Egypt. The Egyptian neighbors were giving things to them. Oh, well, here's this gold pot I don't need anymore, and here's the silver censer, and oh, by the way, take all my flatware, you might need that. That's kind of what happened here. Now, some of the people that were donating may have also been people who were related to those who had left. Now, remember that there's 70 years of things that happen in Babylon, in the Babylon captivity. And it may be hard for us to understand, but that's enough time for 2 generations, possibly 3. So the people that we're talking about today, leaving Babylon and heading for Jerusalem, weren't the people that came from Jerusalem. In other words, they were the relatives. This is going to pose a problem, we'll see as we get through things. But Cyrus actively assisted the Jews in rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem under Zerubbabel and Jeshua, the high priest. Cyrus restored the temple treasures to Jerusalem and allowed building expenses to be paid out of the royal treasury. That's interesting. Cyrus's contribution helped to restart the temple worship practices that had languished for 70 years. 70 years of the Jewish captivity. Some commentators point to Cyrus's decree to rebuild Jerusalem as the official beginning of Judaism. I don't know. It's just some commentators observe that. Besides his dealing with the Jews, Cyrus is known for his advancement of human rights. He was a brilliant military strategist. He bridged the Eastern and Western cultures. In other words, he found a way for them to merge together. He had a tremendous amount of influence, and he was a person that God chose to use to fulfill important Old Testament prophecy. God's use of Cyrus as a shepherd for his people illustrates the truth of Psalms 21:1. It says, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a water course wherever he pleases." We're told that God allows people to come to power in order to further his desires or needs. And sometimes we don't see it that way, but that's what we're told. Now, when we begin with verse 5, everything is kind of started to set in motion. The descriptions of the conditions in captivity, they were given by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 29. And they're historically in a lot of the Jewish documents. So if you look at some of the Jewish history from that time or very soon thereafter, a lot of this material we have is confirmed there. One thing we can conclude is that they didn't fare all that badly in Babylon. In other words, they weren't enslaved as they were in Egypt. They weren't put to hard labor to, do whatever it is they did in Egypt. They basically were allowed to exist as a group of people influenced by the Babylonians. So they didn't have it all that bad. This may have contributed to what we learn later in chapter 2 as to how many people actually came back. But they were able to own homes. They were able to operate businesses. They were able to continue with their religious practices, at least in a limited way. They could educate their own children. They could pretty much live normal lives. Doesn't really sound like much of a captivity, does it? Many of them would prefer to continue in their present condition. Well, we're happy here. We're used to it. We've been assimilated into the culture here. We get used to it. How we say it doesn't take very long to lose the church habit. You miss a few weeks and it just gets easier and easier. Well, that's kind of what happened. They were allowed to exist in Babylon and pretty much were on their own. There were very few requirements that were pressed upon them. The ones who chose to return, as we see, would be largely motivated by religious reasons. Isaiah and others had foreseen the return of a purified remnant. In other words, in actual fact, it would have been predominantly mostly godly people, people who were truly loyal to God. Health, that could have prevented some of the people from returning. Just suppose that you were 20 years old when you were taken out of Jerusalem and brought to Babylon. It is conceivable that you could still be alive, but you may not be in any kind of condition to travel. At 90, I'm not sure. We have a few people who are 90 here, and they're doing pretty well. I'm hoping I do that well when I'm 90. But yeah, they wouldn't want to make that. Was a very long trip up along the river, all the way down, and then back down into Jerusalem. That was a very, very lengthy trip. In verse 5, we noted that most of the people that returned were chiefly from Judah and Benjamin. These were the tribes who had been close to the temple. There would have been a disproportionate number of Levites, and especially priests, who had been most intimately, if you will, identified with Israel's religious affairs. That would have been kind of what those people would be looking at. All right, let's see here. So it said, Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods, lowercase. Cyrus, king of Persia, brought these out in the charge of Mithridath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. They got some great names in those days, didn't they? I mean, those are some really, really very popular names. If you ever have any male children, you already consider Mithridath and Sheshbazzar as very popular names. You guys are too late. Sorry, you didn't really check that book, did you? Now Sheshbazzar, we'll get there in a minute. In verse 6, the gifts to the travelers were again put into two categories: those who would assist in financing and those which were offered to God, possibly used in sacrifice and in reconstruction of the temple. It's appropriate that free will offerings were given to the temple. Its early predecessor, the tabernacle, had been built with free will offerings exclusively. That's recorded in Exodus 35. Remember, the people gave so much, Moses had to tell them, stop. We got more than what we need here. You can't keep giving it to us. We were talking about, getting rid of stuff in our houses now, and my kids have already got whatever they want, and they've already told me, anything left, we don't want it, Dad. When you go, the house will be emptied out by junkers, and it'll hit the big dumpster out front. I didn't really want to hear that, but that's fine. Now, the list of the vessels that were taken from the temple by the Babylonians and now given back to Israel, we've got some of that, and we'll get to it in just a minute. But they're kind of a reminder of how spectacular the temple really was. In previous times, we know that over time the temple was built, destroyed, rebuilt, and then destroyed. So a lot of this kind of stuff is, we know about these things. But the stuff that had been preserved, which we'll get to in a minute, were things that the Babylonians, wouldn't be that Nebuchadnezzar primarily have been afraid to touch. They would have been things that would have been considered holy or righteous, and that for them to meddle with those items could have been bad. For them, they would have been considered unclean. In other words, they would not have been acceptable for use on a daily or in any kind of a religious practice. We'll get to the list in a minute, but if it seems kind of excessive, you've got to remember that they were used for an entire community of priests, and the temples in ancient times were used as government banks. They were expected to be repositories of wealth and of, great, the crown jewels, if you will. And again, Sheshbazzar, he's not really clearly identified. He's mentioned in the Bible by only Ezra. There's a good possibility that it was another name for Zerubbabel because of the reference to Prince of Judah. All right. We are moving right along here. This is exciting. Okay, and this was the number of them, the items that they gave back. They said 30 basins of gold, 1,000 basins of silver, 29 censers, 30 bowls of gold, 410 bowls of silver, and 1,000 other vessels. All of the vessels of gold and of silver were 5,400. I didn't add it up, but I don't think it matters. All of these did Sheshbazzar bring up when the exiles were brought up from Babylonia to Jerusalem. Now verses 9 and 10 kind of provide really different descriptions. I don't know if it's overlaid, but depending on the translation that you read, it's difficult to know what these things really are. Were they forks? Were they spoons? Were they plates? Were they silver golds? Or were they, gold watch sinks? Those kinds of things. Not really clear. The original language is not clear. Now, I know that explanation doesn't really solve anything or give you any answers. It doesn't answer anything for me, but, that's why there's some obscurity there, I think. Fortunately, it doesn't really affect the story, but it is interesting when you look at it. Verse 11 says there's 5,400, but if you add up 9 and 10, if none of it's overlapped, it comes up to be, Randy? 2,499. And one suggestion is that the figure has been corrupted in transmission, in other words, scribal errors. The people that translated the original codex for the Revised Standard Version, what they did is they looked at other pseudepigraphia, which was what we call apocrypha. They looked at first Esdras, and they found a list, and what they did is they substituted figures from that passage in the apocryphal book of first Esdras and used those in their translation. So don't think that people don't reach outside the box to make some things work out. They actually counted what was in the bowls? Could be. The simpler solution is that Ezra just named the major articles and, didn't really worry about the other things in a final total. So yes, Paul's suggestions, what's in the bowl? Where there could have been 125 silver spoons and 120 knives and 120 forks. And, he just said bowls or basins, Didn't say they did or did not contain things. So yeah, very good. Now we're going to see the same kind of thing when we get to the next chapter with a list of names and numbers and then that grand total. Don't get hung up on numbers. Really don't. The numbers of people, the numbers of bowls, the numbers of forks, don't worry about it. It doesn't really make any difference. Okay. During the first full year that Israel was under the rulership of Cyrus, he was led to publish a decree allowing the exiles from Judah, also called Israel, to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple. This was a fulfillment of the prophecies of Jeremiah that the nation would survive the captivity and be restored. Those who did not choose to return would contribute to help with the expenses of those who did and to finance, offerings and repairs to the temple. A number of exiles, chiefly of Judah and Benjamin and Levi, subsequently set out, bringing with them a quantity of valuable items. That's just what happened, thanks to Cyrus's generosity. But again, remember, those things that they gave back, there was a lot more in the temple that they took, but some of those things they probably melted down, they converted to other things, the valuable gold and silver and things like that they were not afraid of, and they were very afraid of some things. They just melted down and reused. So that's kind of the way that works. And that brings us to a close of chapter 1. I never thought we'd get there, but we did. Now on to chapter 2. All right. This is a little cumbersome. I'm going to read it anyway. He says, now these were the people of the province who came up out of the captivity of those exiles whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried captive to Babylonia. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his own town. Now, that's how the ESV, which I think should be easier to read than that. And what it says is, these are the people of the province who returned from captivity, not captiva. That's in down Lee County. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had taken these people as prisoners to Babylon. Now they returned to Jerusalem and Judah, everyone of their own town. These were not the people that Nebuchadnezzar took. These were the relatives of the people that Nebuchadnezzar took, at least the ones who could prove something, and we'll get there. Now, let's read that second verse up there. What have we got? It says, they came with Zerubbabel, Jeshua, which we also know as Joshua, but the priest, not Joshua, the conqueror, Nehemiah, Sariah, Reliah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum, and Banah. Again, very popular names for boys, if any of you are thinking about that. I really like Nehemiah. I don't know a lot of Nehemiahs, but anyway, and my wife would probably be very happy that I didn't come up with any of those. But when it says now these people, that's the whole total list. That's going to be listed from verse 2 to verse 63. The phrase the people of the province. Now, this is something that we sometimes miss when we're talking about these people who returned from Babylon to Jerusalem. People of the province reminds us that the returnees, the people that were coming back from Babylon, they were not free. Understand that they're not returning to a free land. The Judah that they're returning to, where Jerusalem is still a province of Persia. And the people are still subjects to the Persian king. Judah was a subdivision of the 5th Persian satrapy. Right, Randy? Isn't that right? The 5th one, I think. You can look that stuff up. It's all historical information. I'm not cooking it up out of the middle of my mind. It really is a thing. They were not free people. This is different. This is very different from the migration that occurred when the Israelites originally came out of Egypt. They came from slavery to freedom. The first Exodus, that witnessed the birth of a nation, the nation of Israel. The second just saw a migration of people from one locale in Persia to another locale in Persia. Very special to the people who were going back, but nonetheless, they're not free people. They are, they're still subject to the laws of Persia. Now, they may not have been all of that constrictive, but they're not technically on their own.
That explains why the king may have been so generous with his donations toward the bill, because it's still his.
It's still his, exactly. It is still his. And so that's an interesting observation, and we sometimes miss that. The ruler not only approved of the migration, but he also financially supported it. As Paul said, he's just supporting something that's his anyway. If I get them to go over there and do some free work, great. Their return to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his own town, would seem to indicate that Jerusalem was kind of the end of the expedition, and along the way, some might have dropped to claim or reclaim what had been theirs, if they knew. Because there were towns in Judah that outlined Jerusalem. Not all of the people that worked in Jerusalem lived in Jerusalem. So we have that to factor into the equation. What's in verse 2 is just a listing of the heads of the clans that, the people that were considered leaders. It's likely not complete, and some of the names have probably been duplicated due to scribal errors. In Ezra's day, the printing press was very antiquated. I don't think we have a printing press from those days. So I think they probably just had to write everything by hand. People make mistakes. And some of this is, if you've seen written Hebrew, and I'm sure you have, whether you've seen it on a slide here or in study or something, it's very easy to make a mistake. One little jot in the wrong place can change the entire meaning of a word. So, yeah. Oh, a little piece of ink dripped off of my pen and hit right here, which there changed the entire meaning of the phrase. That's what scribal errors are. They're just mistakes in copying. That's right. If you're using hammer and chisel and you made a mistake, you just had to start over.
How many towns exactly are there in Judah or Jerusalem?
Okay. Let's just pretend we got to think about this. And if there was a town left, or there was something they could claim, or something like that, how many towns surround Jerusalem in present-day Israel? A bunch. And so all of these little villages, little clusters of houses, they probably didn't have mayors. They probably didn't have elections, so they may not have legally had legal towns from our perspective, but 2 or 3 houses together might have been considered a village. Well, okay, understand that the primary reason they went back was to rebuild the temple, okay? But not everybody lived in Jerusalem. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Now, what after verse 2? If you're looking at the second chapter, Ezra, there's a long list of names and statistics, Why are such lists frequently included in the Bible? Didn't authors realize how boring it is to read those names we can't read? It doesn't make for easy reading. It doesn't. It's not very rewarding. I know Ken wants to say something, but I'm not done yet. But I addressed this last week, 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. Now, what's going on here? All right, so names and events are part of the fabric history. And their inclusion is a reminder that the events were historical. And one generation at least could have verified or questioned their authenticity. Judaism and Christianity share the distinction of being historical religions. There is some finality and some decisiveness to historical events. You want to add anything, Ken? Or is that where you were going?
You commented about the long list of names here. The Jewish people, remember, they had a promised land, and you had an inheritance in that promised land. And how you were to trace back your inheritance during the Jubilee or other events was who you related to.
Exactly. That is why it's so important. Why do you think 2 of the gospel writers trace the lineage of Jesus? In one case, they trace it from the father and from the mother backwards through history to establish, this is absolutely happening. They had a promise, and the promise was based upon your relationship. Remember that long term, and you remember Jacob and Esau and that thing called a birthright? You know, this is why all of this stuff is critical to the Jewish nation. Archaeologists, philologists, and technicians that study history, they find this list of names extremely informative. The fact, for example, that some of the names resemble those from earlier parts of the Bible may indicate the completeness of the break with the past. In other words, you don't see the names of the people who left Jerusalem listed with the names of the people who went back. Remember how many generations could have been in that 70 years? 2 or 3. There's absolutely no doubt. So the same people that left aren't the people that came back. If you could not trace your lineage in a conclusive and comprehensive manner, you may be left out. A philologist, he'll note that many of the names contain foreign words. This might explain that the people that came back were born in Babylon, were exposed to the Babylonian culture and absorbed some of the things that they were exposed to, like kids' names. And so many of the names are more Babylonian than they are Hebrew. And that's what's going on here. Now, a philologist is a person who studies the history of language, literature, and written records. It comes from the Greek word philologia, which means love of learning, discussion, and literature. So, if your name and the names of your friends, your close friends, were on that list, you'd find it very interesting. If names weren't important to us, how come so many of us keep old church directories? And I know you do. You can't tell me you don't. I've seen them in your houses. Names anchor points in time and memories. When I mention Noah, what do you think of? What about Abraham, Moses, Solomon, Jesus? We all call back from our memory events surrounding those people. When you read verse 2, what name is missing? Well, I didn't see Sheshbazzar. If that was an important name, it wasn't there. It doesn't appear again until Ezra 5. That's why I think Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel are the same person. Now, we're going to see a very similar list in Nehemiah. Names are important. You ever wonder how all the leaders in verse 2 might have been connected, or why were they listed? Were they contemporaries? In other words, they all grow up together? For example, if this is a list of contemporaries, why does it include leaders in later expeditions? Why is Nehemiah listed when we know he didn't go back for several years later? Mordecai. Where do we read Mordecai? In Esther. In that 58-year window that's in the middle there. They fit a later period. Ezra's name isn't there. I didn't see it, but it might be Sariah. And so Big V, or Big Valley, he's the name of the governor of Judah under Darius II. It's more likely that the persons in verse 2 are other men of the same name and not persons better known from later times. Perhaps there was a Nehemiah then and a Nehemiah later. It can happen. There is at least one other person in this congregation whose name is Sam. At least that admits it. But some people have the same names. That's just the way it goes. If you read this passage, starting with verse 2, and follow it through to Ezra 3, which we'll get to next week, I hope what you're going to find is it results in the end of a big religious festival. And so this is an event, and this could be, okay, these were the attendees, and these all shared something to do with this event. Don't know. but very possible. You know, verse 2 concludes with the phrase, the number of the men of the people of Israel. And then what comes next, okay, that is a list of what I think are probably clan leaders, tribal leaders, but not so much tribes, because remember the tribal concept is non-existent at this point. We had the 12 tribes the Israelites were organized and formulated based upon the lineage that they all had, but by now, and especially because of the captivity, not just the captivity, but what happened to Israel, the northern kingdom? It was assimilated by the Assyrians. And those tribes, pretty much, if they didn't migrate south to Judah and Benjamin, disappeared. I mean, historically disappeared. You can't find the tribe of Reuben. You can't find those tribes anymore. They have lost their identity through choices that they made. God allowed them to be assimilated into other cultures. They're gone, you know. When you read those names and it says sons of, could also be translated descendants of. The emphasis here, as is normal in the Old Testament, is on a social unit, a family, rather than an individual. So that's why one name. The next section is people that were mainly identified by towns. Okay, so there's a few towns in here, but they're nearly all the names of communities, although Elam in verse 31 kind of presents a puzzle. Elam's listed with people under the leaders, you know, the tribal or clan leaders, and then he's listed again under the towns. But the author, the person who wrote it, said that this was the other Elam. You know, in verse 31, he says this is the other Elam. So he made a distinction with that. But just like names of people, names of towns also serve as anchor points. One of the towns that's listed in that list of towns is a little town named Bethlehem. And everybody will call back and say, that's the birthplace of Jesus. That's where David was. He was in Bethlehem. These, you know, we think about those things and they represent someone or some event. The other thing is that the people that were mentioned in 36 through 58 were certain people connected with the temple and worship. I do find it interesting that certain priests are listed apart from the mention of Levites, which is a whole other level of discussion. What happened to the priesthood in general? The priests in verses 36 to 39, they're first in the rank among those being connected to the temple, but of the 4 clans or households which follow, 3 are identifiable, being among the 24 courses that were appointed in David's time to serve in rotation at the altar. You got to go back to 1 Chronicles chapter 24 to dig this out. But they mention Jediah, Immer, and Haram. Pashur may have been a replacement for one of the other groups or an alternative name for one of them. It is identified with the priesthood somewhere else as well. You know, we might wish these names were a lot easier to understand, because if it said Reuben, or if it said Benjamin, or if it said, you know, Simeon, we might make a connection. But because these names are so different, are so foreign to us, it's difficult to do that. But again, remember, Northern Kingdom Israel, gone. Before the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar ripped these people out of Jerusalem and out of Judah. It's gone. So they're really not an identifiable entity at that point. Of the Levites that are identified in the addition of the priests, there's only 74 mentioned. The Jeshua is, you know, another name. Is it Joshua, who was the chief priest at that time, or is it just another priest? Well, it could have been. It's also likely that the Levites were not directly involved in the religious duties as priests. If you read Ezekiel chapter 44, verses 9 through 16, you will see that Ezekiel predicted that the Levites would be demoted and would have their responsibilities related to the temple removed or altered because of their previous sins. This reduction in the size could be a consequence of that. It's also possible that their functions were primarily teaching instead of ministry through the ritual process, so some of them, maybe most, would have remained in Babylon or Persia to furnish the needed instruction to the majority of the people who remained there. Clearly, some things did change with little explanation. The gatekeepers who are mentioned as are the temple servants. Many of the temple servants, if you remember, started out as slaves. Remember the Midianites in Numbers 31 and the Gibeonites in Joshua 9? These were people who subjected themselves or placed themselves in subjection to the Israelites and agreed to serve, and they were pressed into service in the temple service. So that was people that they could trace their lineage, but only traced it because they had originally been slaves who had been brought up into that system. So, lineage is critical. Family names and all of that. The list of names that the priests could establish, in other words, they could establish themselves and where they were, and some were landowners. It's birthrights and all the related stuff. Now, a priest, remember, a priest had to meet a requirement. I'm not sure the requirements are binding right now, because to be a priest, you had to be an Israelite by birth, and you must be taken from the descendants of Aaron, the tribe of Levi. That's in Exodus 28, verse 1 and following. No one else must take the office on himself. We read that in Hebrews 5:4. So it had been one of the Levites that caused a problem. Well, we know that there were some problems with some of the priests and some of what they did. But in Numbers 25, I know I'm running out of time. Numbers 25, the Levites were the people that supported God and prevented the people from falling subject to heathen gods and customs during the wanderings in the wilderness. Those were the people who kind of kept people on track. So they were chosen to be servants in the house of the Lord. And so, but what happened in the priestly line? Well, it got messed up. So if you could not establish who you were or what you were doing there, you did have recourse. The problem is that the purpose or the ability for recourse was another thing. Though these sought, the people that could not trace their lineage, these sought their registration among those enrolled in the genealogies, but they were not found there. So they were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. The governor told them that they were not to partake of the most holy food until there should be a priest to consult the Urim and the Thummim. Well, guess what? They got lost. So that presented a whole other kettle of cows. Somewhere in the transition from captivity to 70 years in Babylon, these items couldn't be found. Another problem. And then totals, numbers, how many, how much livestock. Interestingly enough, when you look at the number of livestock and things like that that are listed, it says 42,360, besides their male and female servants and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm not going to read it because we're going to hit the button in a minute. You know, look at the listing of livestock. I mean, it's not a very large number of animals for that number of people. It's like one beast of burden for 6 people. So, yeah, that was a problem. And read the rest of the chapter. I'm not going to go back over it. Basically, it talks about how much they gave and what they gave. And it finishes that chapter out. We'll start in chapter 3 next week. Let's have a quick prayer and then we'll be dismissed. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your bountiful blessings. We thank you for your word, which provides us an understanding of the desires that you had for your people yesterday and today. We know, Father, that you are our true God, and we truly want to worship you and do your will. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you so much.